All right, students, let's open to Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet, written, of course, by the Bard, the greatest writer of the English language, the inventor of idioms, the playwright for all ages, the genius, William Shakespeare.
Oh, does this sound familiar?
It does to me. Hi, I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Jenna. We are two college students who grew up reading Shakespeare and we found him boring.
And hard to understand. So when our teachers went off about the Bard, we just didn't get it. We hardly saw him as relevant, let alone universal.
But today we want to introduce you to a way of experiencing Shakespeare that shakes things up. It's called the New Historicist Perspective, which makes Shakespeare less perfect and more interesting. So today we want to do two things. One, briefly explain what New Historicism is, and two, model for you what an approach to New Historicism looks like by using it to make this claim. We believe he puts some blame on members of society for the creation of villainy. We'll get to that more in a second, though. For now, let's just start with what in the world is New Historicism?
New Historicism is a theory about the relationship between a text and its historic moment. Here are the bare bones. New Historicism sees a work as embedded in the cultural ideas of its time instead of merely invented in an author's imagination. However, it also recognizes that an author has some control about whether to reinforce or resist those cultural ideas. Finally, the relationship between a text and its culture works in two ways. The text is influenced by the culture, and it goes on to influence that culture. This gives us the fullest perspective on a text, and it gives us a bunch of things to watch out for, like whether the author is agreeing or disagreeing with his time period, whether his ideas might be useful or hurtful today.
Now let's take a behind the scenes peek at how this perspective would look in action. First, we noticed a reoccurring pattern of interaction between society and its outcasts, or capital O others, in Shakespeare's plays. Sometimes that depiction comes across as awfully problematic. One professor named Ayanna Thompson in the podcast Code Switch suggests that Shakespeare actually helped to form and solidify the racist ideology of the West, which is,
Ouch.
yeah, a pretty heavy claim. And it is definitely something we want to be aware of, especially since we'll be discussing identities outside our lived experience. Still, we have cautiously observed that Shakespeare does pick at his culture's stereotypes. And that's where our research question for today comes in. How much does Shakespeare implicate society in the negative behavior of its outcasts? We believe the answer is quite a bit. To explore this question, we are mainly going to focus on two of his most famous outcasts. One of them is Shylock, a Jewish moneylender in the play The Merchant of Venice, who wants a pound of flesh as interest from a guy he hates.
The other outcast for today is Othello, a black general who marries and murders a white woman, Desdemona.
Oof, talk about a tragedy.
Yes, it was. So, Jenna, let's tackle the first component of the new historicist perspective. What was the surrounding culture's ideas about Jews during Shakespeare's time?
Unfortunately, some pretty awful things. For one, Jews were actually banned from living in England, so that's a major clue. Furthermore, Professor James Shapiro, in his book Shakespeare and the Jews, sums up popular early modern stereotypes of the Jew as being a murderer, poisoner, military and political threat, and economic parasite. Suffice to say, many, if not most people in Shakespeare's audience would have had no problem seeing Shylock the Jew as a natural villain.
The issue around Africans is a little bit more complicated. Again, we have that claim by Yana Thompson in Code Switch that racist ideology was just forming at the time, and Shakespeare might have helped to enforce it. However, scholar Ian Smith notes that early modern works often painted Africans as dishonest, cruel, sexually excessive, and overall threats to the supposedly civilized English society. And we definitely see these stereotypes surface in Othello, but the question is whether Shakespeare reproduces them or complicates them.
And that leads us to the second component of New Historicism, what the author himself has to say on the topic.
So I already know that Shakespeare's Shylock is greedy, bloodthirsty, and vengeful, which seems to match the early modern stereotypes. Going back to our research question, though, does Shakespeare seem to say that such wickedness is just innate because of his Jewish identity, or does he offer a different explanation?
I would argue the latter. People in Shakespeare's environment, most notably Christians, seem to incite many of his evil actions. For starters, there is one really famous section of the play where Shylock is basically like, "Hey, Christian sirs, don't I have eyes like you? Can't I feel and hurt like you? I'm human, you know?" So here he calls out the Christians' hypocrisy for their unkindness towards a fellow man. Furthermore, Shylock explains that his bloodthirstiness is simply a reciprocation of harsh treatment he received from Christians. In one such instance, Shylock tells the Christians, "Thou callest me a dog before thou hadst a cause. But since I am a dog, beware my fangs." In that quote, Shylock is saying that Christians originally had no cause to mistreat him. Yet because Christians treat him as subhuman, Shylock just goes ahead and operates out of that identity, behaving in a subhuman way or in an inhuman way.
So it sounds like Shakespeare is putting some responsibility on the in society for Shylock's behavior.
Correct. But let's see if anything similar appears again in other plays. What kind of explanations does Shakespeare offer for Othello's seemingly murderous behavior, Stephanie?
Yeah, so the plot of the play does paint a very unflattering picture of Moors, who, by the way, might have been Africans or Muslims. For the sake of simplicity, we're going to assume that Othello was African. So anyway, Othello starts off as an eloquent, just, rational general, and the end of the play has him strangling his loyal wife based on the testimony of a nasty coworker, Iago. As Elise Marx describes, this allows for the interpretation that used to be very popular, that Othello was only able to put on the veneer of civilized society, but his innately wild, savage nature is revealed at the end. The tragedy is that he managed to permeate civilized society and desolate poor Desdemona.
Stephanie, things are not looking good for our point.
No, but this interpretation overlooks the influence of Iago and, on a broader scale, the toxic Venetian society that Othello tries to join. Ian Smith, who I mentioned before, suggests that it's really Iago who displays the dishonesty, cruelty, and jealousy usually associated with Moors. Smith even suggests that Shakespeare investigates the races as social constructions and not as essences. So it's possible to play Othello as the victim of manipulation in a racist society. Like Shylock, Othello is the victim of derision, notably the accusation that his wife's love is the result of nature's error or witchcraft. By joining this racist culture, Othello the Venetian learns to hate Othello the Moor, and that split is destructive and self destructive. This leads him to doubt his wife's loyalty, for how could she love a Moor, and finally kill himself, calling himself a dog as he does so. These final lines succinctly illustrate Othello's downfall. He has joined a society who hates him, so he has learned to hate himself.
So, yet again, Shakespeare portrays an outcast's negative behavior as being incited by other members of society.
Yes, rather than solely attributing these characters' actions to their blackness or their Jewishness, as one might expect him to given the cultural context, Shakespeare seems to be confronting the members of the in society, suggesting that they might have a hand in creating and sustaining these destructive behaviors.
Exactly. Which brings us to our third and final area of new historicist examination: how Shakespeare's plays have been used throughout time to influence audience members.
Let's start with Merchant of Venice. How has that text been interpreted?
Well, that could be another research paper by itself. For now, let's just borrow Dr. James Shapiro's words by saying that it, quote, sits on a razor's edge, end quote. It is on edge because it's been used to support both anti Semitic and anti Semitic causes throughout the centuries. More recently, though, actors like Al Pacino have played the role of Shylock in such a way that audience members feel sympathy, even solidarity, with this outcast.
I saw a similar dynamic in Othello. While past productions depicted the revelation of Othello's innately violent nature, modern actors have been able to depict Othello as instead corrupted by his social environment. But that's not always what audiences get.
No, sometimes the play serves to reinforce these problematic ideas. Ayanna Thompson references a study where a researcher asked audiences about their views on anti Semitism before and after productions of The Merchant of Venice. The findings? The audiences felt more comfortable in their anti Semitic ideas after seeing the play.
So, we don't want to overstate our claim. These plays can still be dangerous. However, by comparing Shakespeare's works to those within his time period, we are able to see how Shakespeare might have been pushing back on his cultural ideas that and others are innately corrupt. He suggests that the in group of society should reflect on their role when they are faced with the supposedly monstrous behavior of its outcasts. Is that enough for today? Maybe not. But it is something to think about.
Wow, that's a lot we just covered. Let's zoom out for a second. Is Shakespeare a universally appealing divinity of literature?
Nope, he was a man. With new historicism, we have a more complicated, rather than worshipful, perspective on Shakespeare. When we study his works, or anyone's, we can look at the cultural ideas of the historic context, what the author did with those ideas, and how the work was received.
After investigating Shakespeare's depiction of others through these three focuses, we saw that he did advance some of the troubling cultural views of his time. He certainly allowed people to continue to associate Jews with murderous villainy and Africans with barbarity. Still, though, he points out that these very same villains and antiheroes are the victims of social prejudices around them. This element makes his plays fascinating springboards into conversations that are relevant to our times.
For example, who would be the modern day Othello or Shylock around you? Are they innately bad, or are they reacting to how they've been treated?
Wow, what a thought. Not very comfortable to think about.
Nope, but these conversations are exactly what keeps Shakespeare relevant, and he's not going anywhere.
Well, thank you for tuning in. We hope this video has given you some tools to stop yawning.
And start questioning. Thanks for watching. We hope this video was helpful, and if you're super interested, see if Google Scholar can hook you up with any of the sources in our references.